Highgrove can look like Camilla's sanctuary, the place where smiling photographs turn marriage into ownership. But the paper tells another story. Under cold office light, the crown on her head fades beside the paperwork, showing Charles reportedly paying rent to the duchy, now controlled by Prince William. The deadline sits inside the paperwork, not inside the music of ceremony. Love may fill rooms, gardens, and old routines, but it cannot change the property record. The Queen is not mistress of that ground. She is tied to the position of a lifelong tenant, protected by arrangements that belong to Charles more than to her. To understand why the rent check matters, the file has to move back to August 1980. In Gloucestershire, a property contract gave Highgrove House and 347 surrounding acres to the Duchy of Cornwall. The seller was Maurice Macmillan, son of a former prime minister, and the reported price was around £865,000. On the purchase record, that figure looks less like a domestic purchase than an institutional decision. The approval line sits inside a much older paper world where seals, accounts, and succession matter more than romance. The money was not framed as Charles opening a private checkbook. It came from duchy resources. Reports also link the purchase to the sale of other royal estate properties, including part of distant Daglingworth. That detail changes the entire meaning of the house. The Duchy of Cornwall had been created in 1337 under Edward III to provide income for the heir to the throne. It was not a sentimental country fund for whichever prince happened to love a garden. It was a constitutional engine built to support the office of the Duke of Cornwall. When Charles approved the Highgrove purchase, he acted through that office. He did not take out an ordinary personal mortgage or buy a freehold as a private gentleman. Highgrove entered an estate portfolio attached to succession. From the first legal page, the house belonged to the structure, not to Charles as a man. He controlled it because he was heir, and only while that role gave him control. The beauty of the Georgian facade could soften the image, but the legal foundation stayed colder. Highgrove was never a private kingdom. It was an asset held by an ancient financial machine waiting for the next heir to inherit its command. The reversal came in September 2022, when the old constitutional mechanism activated without debate. Charles became king, and the Duchy of Cornwall passed automatically to Prince William, the new heir. A portfolio worth more than £1 billion moved with the title, not with family sentiment. The man who had managed Highgrove for decades no longer stood as its constitutional owner. In the legal room, that change needed no raised voice. Papers moved, titles changed, and the estate followed succession. The king had gained the crown, yet lost the financial crown that had carried Highgrove under him. That is the humiliation hidden inside the rent. To remain at Highgrove, Charles needed an arrangement with the duchy now controlled by William. The agreement is often described through the language of long-term occupation. It allowed continued residence while recognizing another legal authority beneath it. A formal lease turns memory into payment. Reports place the annual rent at around £700,000 paid to the duchy. The check does not make Charles weak as king. It shows that kingship and property control are not always the same thing. He can open parliament, receive ambassadors, and wear the crown. Yet at Highgrove, the relevant file runs through his son's estate office. That is why the image cuts so hard. The father who once governed the duchy now pays rent into the system held by the son. The arrangement may be ordinary inside professional estate management, but the symbolism is ruthless. Charles is not being evicted from his past. He is being reminded that his past was never held outside succession. Buckingham Palace cannot declare the land personally his because the law of the duchy does not follow palace feeling. The estate operates through office, title, lease, and account. Once Charles became sovereign, he ceased to be Duke of Cornwall. The ground moved under him at the exact moment the crown rose above him. Highgrove stayed in place, but the power beneath it changed hands. For Camilla, the darker part of the lease is absence. In the estate papers, her title does not convert into ownership. The Queen is not the freeholder of Highgrove. She is not the Duke of Cornwall. She is not the party whose office controls the property. Her standing comes through marriage to Charles, not through the duchy's constitutional design. That distinction may sound technical, but technical language is where royal power often hides. A crown can glitter above a dinner table, while the land beneath that table belongs to a different file. Remove the marriage from the document, and Camilla's authority at Highgrove thins at once. She may live there, receive guests, influence rooms, and move through gardens associated with her life beside Charles. Yet none of those acts gives her the estate. She does not own a brick, a tree, or a path by right of her own office. Her position is a residence by connection, supported by the king's arrangement and the duchy's administration. The new landlord is not hostile in law. He is Prince William. That fact is enough. This is the hidden fragility of a consort's status. Camilla's rank is immense in ceremony, but her property position at Highgrove is conditional. It depends on Charles's life, his lease, and the continuing administrative tolerance of the estate controlled by the heir. She can decorate the rooms, host within them, and appear in photographs that make belonging look permanent. The ledger says otherwise. On paper, she is almost invisible. Property law has reduced the Queen's domestic certainty to a borrowed residence within an ancient machine. Yet Highgrove carries more than legal ownership. Beneath the accounts lies another layer: memory, older attachments, and the emotional fingerprints left before Camilla became central. In autumn 1981, after the wedding bells had faded, Highgrove received its first public vision of domestic hope. Diana arrived not as an owner in the legal file, but as the young Princess of Wales expected to soften stone into family life. Diplomatic smiles could fill photographs, yet the deeper work happened in quieter rooms. Curtains, fabrics, colors, and bedroom details began carrying her taste, turning the Georgian house from institutional property into a place with a human pulse. Outside, the swimming pool carried its own harder symbolism. It had been given as a wedding gift from British soldiers, an object wrapped in celebration, but marked by the language of military offering. Blue water lay behind the house like a polished promise. In the 1980s, Highgrove became a weekend escape from London pressure and palace discipline. Diana drove her sons there, and the grass recorded a different history than any title deed could hold. Small feet crossed lawns, voices moved through bedrooms, and bedtime routines gave the house a claim no ledger could measure. That is why the later ownership question cuts so deeply. Diana never held Highgrove as private property, but she marked it as a family home. Her presence sat in fabrics, nursery rhythms, and the ordinary roots of two boys growing up beneath royal expectation. The walls learned another version of royalty, built from school bags, wet towels, and evenings away from formal palace watching. When the marriage broke down and her separate life centered at Kensington Palace, Highgrove did not lose those earlier years. It kept them like fingerprints under paint. The house became a witness to the softest chapter of a story that later hardened around grief, silence, and public memory. For Charles, Highgrove meant something different and equally consuming. It was not only a royal residence with bedrooms, staff, and arranged weekends. It became the largest creative project of his life. a place where his environmental beliefs could be turned into soil, hedges, orchards, and argument. When he arrived in 1980, the land around the house was far from the organic vision later attached to his name. Over more than 4 decades, he turned the garden into a statement of order against modern waste. The house gave him territory where belief could become design. The plans were practical before they became famous. Mud-marked garden maps, revised beds, composting systems, and organic planting slowly replaced the ordinary country house template. Charles worked with skilled advisors, including Rosemary Very, whose eye helped shape parts of the garden's formal beauty. Roses, clipped walks, vegetables, trees, and meadows became more than decoration. They formed a living manifesto. The 15 acres around the house acquired rooms of green thought, each one arranged to prove that tradition and ecology could belong together. The wildflower meadow made the argument without a speech. Bees moved through color and rough grass, where control gave way to managed abundance. Elsewhere, quieter spaces appeared behind trees, including secluded corners and a small spiritual atmosphere protected by planting. Acer leaves, paths, scents, and shade helped make the garden feel less like a backdrop than a private language. Charles placed time into the ground, season after season. His hands, money, and philosophy entered the soil. After Diana's death, Highgrove also became a place of retreat from public pressure. The garden could absorb what interviews, headlines, and palace rooms could not settle. That does not mean it healed every wound. It means Charles used the estate as a structure of emotional order, a controlled world where he could prune, plant, and continue. Every cabbage bed and oak line carried the discipline of survival. By the early 21st century, Highgrove had become inseparable from him. It was an environmental legacy, a private refuge, and the most personal project he had built inside a property he still did not privately own. Then, after the marriage in 2005, Camilla entered Highgrove as a permanent presence beside Charles. The country residents began to hold another woman's furniture, flowers, habits, and routines. Rooms could be rearranged, cushions replaced, and fresh arrangements placed where older domestic traces once lived. None of that was unusual in a new marriage. Yet in this house, every change met an existing memory. Highgrove was not empty when Camilla crossed the threshold. It already contained Diana's taste, the boy's childhood, and Charles's decades of planted devotion. Camilla worked to make the house part of her life with Charles. She hosted, settled, and helped shape the country atmosphere around them. In public photographs, the residence could be presented as a calm rural base for the king and queen. But emotional property does not obey redecorating. Each corridor still carried the knowledge that Diana had lived there first before reconciliation made Camilla central. Every attempt to make Highgrove feel settled had to move through a past that refused to leave. This was not a legal dispute. It was a family pressure sealed inside walls. For William, that pressure was more than royal nostalgia. Highgrove belonged to the landscape of childhood, to weekends on grass, to memories of a mother before the public fracture became permanent. Seeing another woman inhabit that space placed private memory inside an institutional arrangement controlled by property law. Charles wanted continuity with Camilla and protection for the life they had built. William inherited memory as well as land. 4 layers met there: Diana's early domestic trace, the childhood of her sons, Charles's organic creation, and Camilla's later residence. Together, they made the house a delayed charge. When the duchy passed to William on September 8, 2022, the child who once ran across its lawns became the landlord over his father's personal sanctuary. On September 8, 2022, the country watched Balmoral and mourned the end of a reign. But inside the Duchy of Cornwall, another event happened with no public ceremony. The old machinery moved. A new ledger page opened, and the title Duke of Cornwall passed to Prince William. No trumpet announced the property transfer. No emotional consultation was required. The rule from 1337 did the work in silence, moving land, income, and authority toward the heir at the exact moment Charles became king. That transfer included one of the most charged houses in the royal system, Highgrove. The estate, the gardens, and the wider duchy structure no longer sat under Charles as Prince of Wales. They moved beneath William. The child who had once crossed those lawns became the legal head of the estate that held them. The father became sovereign, but the land beneath his private sanctuary now answered to his son's office. That is the cold paradox of royal property. Charles gained the throne and lost the duchy in the same constitutional breath. The portfolio was worth around £1.26 billion, carrying land, investments, and residences through the office, not through sentiment. Highgrove remained physically unchanged, but its legal gravity shifted at once. In the garden darkness, Charles could still sit among paths he had shaped for decades. On paper, he was no longer the man controlling the ground. The new structure turned an old family space into a landlord and tenant arrangement. Charles could stay, but staying now required formal administration through William's duchy. The King of the United Kingdom had become a tenant within the estate system held by his heir. That reversal did not need cruelty to feel severe. It needed only law, succession, and a page turned at the correct moment. The first financial shock came through accounting, not speeches. In the Duchy of Cornwall's 2024 financial papers, one line drew attention because of what it no longer paid. Annabel Elliot, Camilla's sister, had provided interior design services linked to duchy properties across the Charles years. For 19 years, her name had belonged to the domestic economy around the old Prince of Wales. Under William, that line moved to nil. The word was small on the page, but it carried a clear administrative message. No palace balcony was needed. No accusation was issued. The extreme close-up is enough. Payment to Annabel Elliot, nil. A whole channel of family-linked work had stopped in the new administration. The Telegraph later reported the end of those payments, making the ledger impossible to dismiss as rumor. The careful reading is important. This does not have to be framed as personal revenge. William inherited a major estate and was entitled to manage it professionally. A new Duke of Cornwall can choose different suppliers, different controls, and different standards for contracts. In that sense, the decision can be read as governance, not drama. But royal governance is never neutral when family history sits behind the numbers. Under Charles, Annabel Elliot's work had grown inside a world where Camilla's family stood close to the future king. Under William, the new accounts showed no automatic continuation of that comfort. The old personal network did not pass untouched into the Wales era. Money stopped flowing where precedent alone might have kept it moving. That is why the figure mattered. It suggested an estate being pulled away from inherited habit and placed under tighter audit. For Camilla, the symbolism was sharper than the paperwork. Her sister's contracts belonged to the Highgrove world she had helped settle into after 2005. Removing those payments did not remove Camilla from the house. It removed a visible sign that her wider family would be carried by duchy custom. William did not need to say the words. The accounts said them for him. The new estate would not finance the old circle simply because Charles once allowed it. In modern royal management, nil can be more final than a public rebuke. Then came another pressure point: the garden itself. In July 2025, the Times reported a staffing crisis at Highgrove Gardens. The place Charles had spent decades shaping as an organic project now appeared under strain. Reports described a staff exodus, with 11 of 12 full-time gardeners said to have handed in their notice. The image was difficult to separate from the wider pressure around Highgrove's management. The gardens were operated through the King's Foundation, under arrangements connected to the estate. That meant daily work depended on staffing, budgets, management decisions, and expectations shaped around Charles's long vision. The reported complaints pointed toward low pay, pressure, understaffing, and the demands of maintaining a garden shaped by Charles's exacting standards. That combination is not glamorous. It is the administrative underside of a royal dream. A garden that looks spiritual from a distance still depends on wages, staff levels, schedules, and morale. When those systems weaken, even a beloved royal project starts to reveal its costs. For Charles, this was more than a workplace issue. Highgrove's garden had been his private language for decades. To see its workforce under strain meant seeing the living structure of his legacy become vulnerable. For Camilla, the crisis exposed another limit. She could be queen beside Charles, but she could not command the duchy's financial machine from outside its legal chain. The fortress around her husband's emotional world was being tested by budgets, leases, and staff decisions beyond her direct reach. By then, the pattern was clear. The property structure did not attack with noise. It worked through title transfer, accounts, contract endings, and management pressure. The management pressure around Highgrove appeared in the ordinary language of staffing, budgets, and daily work. Camilla's circle was narrowed, Charles's sanctuary was conditional, and the heir's estate office held the pen. Faced with that system, the Queen's safest ground would have to be somewhere else, beyond the duchy's reach. In 1996, after the end of her first marriage, Camilla bought Ray Mill House in Wiltshire as a private home. The reported price was £850,000. Unlike Highgrove, this was not duchy land, not a palace residence, and not an estate held by the machinery of succession. Its wooden gate could close against photographers in a way royal gates never fully could. Inside, Camilla could remove the clothes of ceremony, wear old jeans, move through sunlit rooms, and exist without the choreography of courtiers, equerries, and public expectation. That freedom matters because it explains the difference between residence and survival. At Clarence House or Highgrove, Camilla's position depends on Charles and the office around him. At Ray Mill, the emotional structure belongs to her own life, her own children, and her own family history. The house gave her a place outside Windsor's formal rhythm. There, Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes were not royal extras but central parts of her private life. It was where grandchildren, dogs, books, food, and private habits could matter more than rank. Ray Mill was never only a retreat, it was a safety system. Camilla understood, perhaps earlier than many observers, that royal grandeur can be conditional. A consort may occupy magnificent rooms without owning the walls. A queen may be photographed beside a fireplace that belongs to an institution. Ray Mill answered that problem with freehold certainty. It gave her ground where the crown could not easily turn affection into leasehold, protocol, or administrative permission. In a life surrounded by borrowed status, Ray Mill remained the one property shaped by personal choice. It was not the largest house in her orbit, but it was the one least dependent on the goodwill of the next reign. The deeper protection appears in the property records. Ray Mill's legal title was later structured through names connected to Camilla's private family. Harry Lopes and Jake Irwin, were identified as trustees connected to the interests of Laura Lopes and Tom Parker Bowles. Under legal office light, those names do not read like decoration. They read like planning. The Windsor line is not the controlling bloodline in that document. The Parker Bowles side is protected through trust structure and private succession. That arrangement reveals a cold understanding of constitutional reality. Camilla's children do not become royal heirs because their mother became queen. They do not acquire automatic places in the court circular. They do not inherit duchy land, crown estate property, or official royal residences by blood. Their security must come from private family arrangements, not from Windsor generosity. Ray Mill therefore functions as more than a mother's house. It is the legal wall around the life Camilla had before the crown fully absorbed her public image. The contrast with Highgrove is severe. At Highgrove, Camilla is attached to Charles's lease, Charles's memories, and William's duchy. At Ray Mill, the future is not written through the Duke of Cornwall. The names in the land registry do not need to bend before a new king's household plan. They protect a private line that stands outside the royal succession. That is why the property matters so much. It is a retreat from the monarchy's ability to rearrange rooms, funds, and official access after a reign ends. Camilla appears to have accepted a strategic trade. She cannot control the great estates of the institution. She cannot transform Highgrove into a personal possession. She cannot give Tom and Laura the protections reserved for born Windsors. But she can preserve a private fortress beyond those rules. The trust structure makes that choice visible. It says the royal story may move on without her full control, but one piece of ground remains outside the future king's direct reach. This is home versus property. Highgrove is property wrapped in memory. Ray Mill is home defended by paperwork. When Charles dies, Camilla's status will change at once. She would no longer be queen consort of the reigning king. Her title could remain dignified, but her place would move away from the center of the sovereign's household. The legal machinery behind Highgrove will not pause because of sentiment. The duchy belongs to the heir, and after Charles, the question of continued residence depends on decisions made under a different sovereign atmosphere. Highgrove may remain preserved, opened more widely to the public, managed through foundation structures, or reshaped for another use. Those are administrative possibilities, not personal certainties for Camilla. The next phase could be shaped through leases, management changes, public access, or estate policy. None of that requires cruelty. It requires only the normal movement of property after a reign ends. That is the hardest part. Camilla would not need to be expelled dramatically for her power there to shrink. The lease could lapse. Terms could change, and the estate could simply reclaim its own logic. As Charles's widow, Camilla would have no automatic freehold right over Highgrove. Her claim flows through Charles, and Charles is mortal. Once his protection ends, her bargaining position becomes far thinner. Ray Mill is the answer to that future. It is the door she can close when Highgrove becomes a file inside the next royal administration. The long game of Windsor property ends where it began. Not with jewels, titles, or affection, but with names on legal paper. Camilla may have won a crown, but she secured her real escape through a private house beyond the reach of the duchy. Camilla may still see Highgrove as the country home she built with Charles while this reign holds. From above, the organic gardens blur under Gloucestershire fog, and her figure fades at the doorway. Inside another room, William's pen taps against duchy papers with colder authority than any royal photograph. A house can be filled with flowers, guests, habits, and memory. The land beneath it answers to a different name, Love made Highgrove feel permanent. Law made it conditional. When Charles's lease reaches its end, the next line will not be written by Camilla. It will be shaped by the Whale's future, by duchy paperwork, and by Diana's eldest son.